And then we have discussed a little bit about the DNA replication, the basic principle of the DNA replication, which are so basically the DNA replication should always happen in a template dependent fashion. Okay, that means the DNA polymerase, which is the main enzyme which performs the DNA replication, should always use a DNA as a template, and subsequently it should incorporate the complementary bases into the nascent DNA strand. For example, if the DNA polymerase is reading a guanine in the template, or if a DNA polymerase finds a guanine in its template, it should incorporate the cytosine, which is the complementary nucleotide for the G in the nascent DNA strand, so that there should be a G to C base pairing. If there is a, it should incorporate T and so on. Okay, so that means the DNA replication should always happen in a template dependent fashion. Okay, and how does DNA replication happens? We have discussed about two particular models. We have discussed about semi-conservative model, where the two DNA strands, so the two DNA strands get separated from each other, and then each of these strands act as a template for the synthesis of the new DNA strands. Okay, so here the blue strands represents the strands which are coming from the parental DNA, parental double-stranded DNA. Everyone please mute themselves, please. Okay, so the DNA strand is coming from the parental DNA, and then it is getting separated from each other, and then each of these template DNA is acting, each of these parental DNA strands acting as a template for the synthesis of the new DNA strand, which is represented red here. Everyone please mute themselves because it's getting recorded, right? If there is a huge of this kind of background noise, you guys will be find difficult to follow the lecture if you want to follow it afterwards, okay, through the recording. Anyway, so here, okay, so in the semi-conservative model, the parental DNA strands get separated from each other, and then each of the strands act as a template for the synthesis of the new DNA strand, so that the daughter DNAs have one strand coming from the parental strand and the other strand which is getting synthesized newly. Okay, that means in the daughter strand, half of the identity of the parental strands remains conserved, and that's why it is known as semi-conservative model. Whereas in the case of the conservative model, the parental DNA strands retains its identity in one of the daughter strand, complete identity in one of the daughter strand, whereas the other daughter strand gets newly synthesized. So one DNA strand, one double-stranded DNA will be completely new. Both of the strands are completely new, and the other one is where both the strands are coming from the parental DNA. So, because in this particular case, the parental DNA, parental double-stranded DNA, completely conserve its identity through the course of replication. That's why it is known as conservative model. Okay. Now, in the previous class, I have mentioned that among these two models, it's only one which is followed throughout the DNA replication for any living organism. Anyone wants to answer that which particular model is followed for DNA replication?
Semi-conservative.
Semi-conservative. Excellent. So
Semi-conservative.
yeah, so it's semi-conservative model. Okay, and we have mentioned about the Michelson-Stultz experiment, which actually proved that for a DNA replication, it follows a semi-conservative mode. Okay, and we are going to discuss this particular experiment because this is an extremely important experiment which actually established the basis or the mechanistic model for DNA replication. Okay, so Messelson and Stahl, two scientists together, performed this experiment in 1958. Remember 1953, when the Watson and Crick has described the structure of the double helical structure of the DNA, right? And after 5 years, Messelson and Stahl have performed this experiment to show that how these double-stranded DNA actually forms during the DNA replication process. Okay, and this is an extremely important experiment because this has, in terms of the overall instrumentation, it utilizes one of the most simple instrument, which is a classical instrument or a classical experiment which has been established long back. Okay, and this experiment is basically the ultracentrifugation technique. Okay, so in this particular technique, what is done is basically it's a centrifuge machine which can perform the centrifugation at a really high speed, 30, 40,000 to 1 lakh RPM. It can rotate. Okay, now why do you need that much of high speed? Because utilizing these ultracentrifuge machines, you can actually separate or characterize macromolecules or biomolecules or biological macromolecules. Okay, so in this ultracentrifugation, it, this in the using ultracentrifuge, Messelson and Stahl has performed one simple experiment which is called density gradient ultracentrifugation experiment. In the density gradient ultracentrifugation experiment, what is done is basically you prepare a salt solution of cesium chloride. So cesium chloride is a salt, and you can prepare different concentration, different percentage contain, so different salt solution of the cesium chloride. Okay, where it has different concentration of the cesium chloride. For example, you can prepare 60 to 10% for density gradient. So 60% cesium chloride, you prepare a solution of 60% cesium chloride and you put it at the bottom, and then you prepare 50% and then you lay it over on the top of the 60%, and then you prepare 40% and then you lay it over on the top of the 50%, and in that way you can put one after another. So different gradients, different concentration containing solutions on the top of one another. Okay. In that case, ultimate, and if you leave the different concentration solutions for in this particular tube for several hours, what will happen is they will diffuse to create a continuous gradient where the top of the tube will be having maximum concentration of the cesium chloride, whereas the bottom should have the minimum concentration of the cesium chloride. Okay, and because cesium chloride is an extremely viscous salt, you would see that the entire course of the gradient, the viscosity of the solution will be differing. So the bottommost part will be the most viscous, whereas the topmost part will be the least viscous. Okay. Now, say for example, you take a little bit of DNA solution, okay, aqueous solution of the DNA, and then you put it on the top of this particular gradient, and then you applied, then you rotate it at maybe 40,000 RPM. What will happen? So during the centrifugation process, it will, due to the centrifugation process, it will apply huge amount of centrifugal force onto this gradient, or you can say that onto this DNA molecule, which has been laid over at the top. Okay, so say for example, you have laid over a solution of DNA at the top of this particular gradient. Okay, so this is the DNA solution. Okay, now as you are centrifuging it at a really high speed, it will impart centrifugal force towards the bottom of the gradient. That means it will push the DNA through the gradient. Okay, so now when the centrifugal force will be applied on the DNA, which will be acting in this particular direction, that means from the top to the bottom of the gradient, at the same time, another force will be applying on the DNA in the opposite direction. What is that particular force? So the DNA molecule, sorry,
Viscous force.
frictional force, right? So the friction, because the viscosity of the gradient of the solution is highest at the bottom and lowest at the top. That means it will apply a frictional force, and the more the DNA will be penetrating through the gradient, the amount of the frictional force will be increasing, right? At some point of time, these two forces will be equal to each other, right? And the DNA will stop moving at that particular stage. As a result of that, it will create a band. So that particular DNA solution which you have laid over at the top of the gradient at the beginning of the centrifugation, if you centrifuge it for certain period of time, for example, maybe 4 to 5 hours, it will penetrate through the gradient, and depending upon the molecular weight of the DNA, because the centrifugal force will be proportional to the molecular weight of the DNA, right? So the heavier the DNA would be, the more it will penetrate, right? So higher will be the centrifugal force and the more it will penetrate before it can come to an equilibrium with the frictional force, right? And subsequently, by how much of the the distance that got traveled by the DNA will give you a idea about the molecular weight of the DNA. Okay, so up to this point, is it clear for everyone? Anyone has any question? Okay, so in that case, so now you know that using a centrifugation, ultracentrifugation process or a density gradient, we call it density gradient centrifugation. Okay, so using this particular density gradient centrifugation experiment, you should be able to get a relative idea about the molecular weight of the DNA. Okay, now what Michelson and Stahl did is, first of all, they have inoculated E. coli, which is a bacteria, very well-known bacteria. Okay, they have inoculated the bacteria in a medium where the sole source, so it's a nutrient media where the bacteria can grow, and there the sole source of nitrogen is ammonium chloride. Okay, and here they have used N15 containing ammonium chloride. Okay, so they have inoculated the bacteria into this N15 containing ammonium chloride media. They have let the bacteria grow. Now usually the replication time or the generation time for bacteria is about 20 minutes. Okay, so you inoculate very little amount of bacteria, few cells of bacteria into this particular culture, and within couple of hours you should be able to see that the entire media becomes turbid, because the bacteria can grow so fast and can saturate this particular media. Okay, now whatever bacteria that will be growing in this particular media should have N15 in their DNA, right? So which particular which particular part of the DNA will incorporate these N15s?
The nitrogenous bases.
Yes. So the DNA contains nitrogenous bases, right? And all of those nitrogenous bases contains multiple nitrogen molecules, nitrogen atoms. And all of those atoms will be N15, right? So the entire length of the DNA will be labeled with the N15. Okay. Now, if you replicate, so say for example, this is the parental DNA strand. So during the DNA replication process, what needs to be done is basically this. Okay, so this DNA replication process, what will be happening is these two strands. So say for example, these are the double-stranded DNA, these are base pairs. Okay, so this double-stranded DNA will get separated from each other. Each of the strands, parental strands, will get separated from each other, and then new strands will be getting synthesized. So these are the parental strand and these are the new daughter strand. Okay, and whatever new daughter strand will be getting synthesized, everything will be N15 labeled, right? So if you take this particular DNA, so say for example, you collect the bacteria, you isolate the DNA from the bacteria, and then you lay it over at the top of this particular gradient. Okay, so the entire DNA will be penetrating through the gradient. If you perform the centrifugation process, the entire DNA will be penetrating through the gradient. Okay, and subsequently it will settle, or it will become equilibrate in the gradient at certain distance. Okay, so everything is N15 level, so accordingly, depending upon their molecular weight, it will settle in the gradient. All right, now say for example, so now say for example, if you take this particular bacteria, okay, same bacteria, and then you culture them in a N14 ammonium chloride containing media. You isolate the DNA and then you perform the centrifugation so that you will get a band for the DNA. So what should be the relative position of that particular band where all the DNA are N14 labeled? What should be the relative position of that particular band? Should it be higher or should it be lower of the N15 band?
So it will be higher.
Yeah. So if this is, say for example, the N15 containing DNA containing band, in that case, if you have a N14, say for example, it will be somewhere here. Okay. So in that way, you should be able to distinguish this one molecular weight, difference in one unit molecular weight in the nitrogen by density gradient centrifugation. So this is the beauty of this particular experiment, that utilizing this density gradient experiment, you can actually distinguish the same DNA molecule which is only having, for one case it is having N14 and the other case it will be having N15. But because there are so many bases in the DNA and all of the bases contains 2 to 3 molecules of nitrogen, that's why the overall mass difference will be really high. And you should be able to distinguish between N15 containing DNA from N14 containing media, containing DNA. Now, in order to prove that which particular mode of DNA replication is getting followed in the bacteria, what they have done is, first of all, Mesencel and Stahl has grown these bacteria in N15 containing media. They have generated bacteria where all the DNAs are N15 labeled. And then subsequently they have collected those bacteria and then they have inoculated that in N14 ammonium chloride containing media. Okay, and then let them grow for 20 minutes because the generation time for the bacteria is 20 minutes. Okay, so what will happen? So say for example, you have inoculated N15 DNA containing bacteria into the media which contains N14 ammonium chloride. So it will start replicating in them. But then whenever it's performing its DNA replication, so say for example, this is the parental DNA strand, it will get separated from each other, and then whatever new daughter DNA will be synthesized, that will be N14 labeled, right? So in that case, if you collect the bacteria after 20 minutes and then you isolate the DNA and then you lay over the DNA on the top of the density gradient to see that where this particular DNA is migrating. Okay. Now initially at the generation 0, where all the DNA were N15 labeled, this was the band. Okay, where all of the bacteria was having N15 containing DNA. Subsequently, you have replicated them in N14 containing media, and just after 20 minutes, after one generation, you isolated the DNA. So all of the DNA should be a hybrid where one DNA will be coming from the parental strand and the one DNA will be newly synthesized. And if it is newly synthesized, it should be N14 containing N14. In that case, it should be a hybrid DNA, right? And because it is hybrid DNA, it should be, in terms of the molecular weight, it should be lesser than the parental DNA. As a result of that, it will be penetrating lesser. Okay. So at the end of the first generation time, you will be getting the DNA, which is a complete hybrid of the where one strand is basically coming from the N15 and the other is which is newly getting synthesized, that should be N14 labeled. So at the end of the first generation, you will be getting complete hybrid DNA molecules. Okay. Now,
sir.
Yes.
Sir, means in the experiment, why are we specifically using cesium chloride for creating the gradient? Means we can use other salt solutions, viscous salt solutions also. Means why are we
Yes, that's possible. But when when biochemists, it's a very classical ancient experiment. Okay, the cesium chloride density gradient. People also use sucrose density gradient. Okay, but usually people use cesium chloride when they try to fractionate nucleic acids. If you try to fractionate proteins are bigger molecules than DNA. Okay, now the pore size, the molecules of the cesium chloride is of such a size is that when you are creating this particular gradient, the pore size in between the gradient is such that it can fractionate the DNA molecules properly. Okay, but when you try to fractionate proteins, you have to use other salt like sucrose. So depending upon the molecular weight, range of the molecular weight, you can use different salts. And it has been shown that cesium chloride works best for the nucleic acid separation. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is what we have seen in at the end of the first generation. Now what will happen if you collect the DNA after 40 minutes? That is at the end of the second generation. Let's see what would happen. Okay. So here you are getting you have at the end of the first generation, what do you have? 100% hybrid DNA molecules, right? Now these DNA molecules subsequently will get segregated into two daughter molecules, right? And subsequently they will get separated from each other. So during the DNA replication, they will get separated from each other and then will synthesize new daughter strands. But whatever daughter strands will be getting synthesized, it will be N14 labeled, right? So at the end of the second generation, what you will be seeing is this, right? Where you have 50% of the DNA molecules which are hybrid and 50% of the DNA molecule which are light, right? So you can again lay them over on the top of the density gradient and you should be able to see two bands. 50% hybrid, 50% light. So if you keep on performing, if you keep on collecting bacteria and then isolate their DNA and perform this density gradient experiment, this is the trend that you will be seeing. So at the 0 generation, 100% bacteria was heavy, was containing heavy DNA. That means N15 DNA. At the end of the first generation, you have received bacteria which are having DNA of hybrid nature. That means one strand was heavy and one strand was light. At the end of the second generation, you have received DNA where 50% of the hybrid, 50% of the light. At the end of the third generation, there will be 25%, 75%. For fourth generation, you should be having 12% and 88%. Okay. Now, why this is happening? This is happening because it's following the semi-conservative mode of DNA replication, because the parental strands are getting separated and then new strands are getting synthesized. So half of the DNA is coming from the parental strand and half of the DNA is getting newly synthesized. Okay, so if you want to test, you can always write. So you can always write it in this fashion. So this is parental DNA. So at the end of the first, so this is, say for example, 0th generation, right? And this is the first generation. So this is complete N15. If you consider the red as a N15 containing DNA, so this is complete N15. So complete heavy DNA. At the end of the first generation, you are having half N15, half N14. That means complete hybrid DNA. At the end of the second generation, what you are getting, 50% molecules are hybrid, 50% molecules are light, right? So you can keep on drawing in this particular fashion and you should be seeing that why this kind of trend is, they have, so why Michelson and Stoll have seen this kind of trend in their density gradient experiment. Okay, so from this pattern, that what they have received from their density gradient experiment, they have established that it's the semi-conservative mode of replication which is followed in case of the DNA replication process. Okay, and later on, the same DNA replication, same experiment has been performed for other organisms as well to show that they also follow the similar approach. So whenever there is a DNA replication process which will be happening in any living organism, it should follow the semi-conservative mode of DNA replication. Okay. So
Sir, will
any
there be
questions?
effect of N15 or N14, means the two different isotopes? Will there be any effect of on this density?
Sorry, could you please repeat your question?
Will there be any effect of the density in this experiment, means the N15 and N14? Do they have different effects? Like how will they react, because they are different isotopes?
Yeah, so different isotopes means one is having, so these two isotopes are different in terms of their molecular weight, right? For one, there is the molecular weight is 14, the other is having 15, right? So there is a 1 unit difference in their molecular weight. But think about it, when the DNA is getting replicated in these media, these N14s or N15s atoms are getting incorporated in the bases, in the nitrogenous bases. Now, say for example, for bacteria, for E. coli, the size of the DNA, the size of the chromosome is about 4,000 base pairs. Okay. Now, each of the base contains 2 to 3 nitrogen atoms, right? So in total, if I consider 4,000, and if in average each of the bases are having 2 units of nitrogen, and if they are differing in 1 unit of mass, that means what will be the difference in the total mass of the DNA? 4,000 into 2, right? So 8,000 will be the difference in their mass, right? So the difference, this particular difference in their mass will be reflected in the overall centrifugal force that is getting imparted on these molecules. Heavier is the mass, higher will be the centrifugal force, and as a result of that, it will penetrate more in these density gradients, right? So that's why heavy DNA containing the DNA which contains the N15 molecules will penetrate higher. The DNA which is containing N14 molecules will be penetrating lesser. If the DNA contains one strand which is N15, the other strand which is N14, it will be penetrating intermediate distance. Is it clear? Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So let's. Anybody has any questions if regarding the Michelson-Stolz experiment? Okay. If not, then we can.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sir, if suppose that the conservative model of DNA was chosen, then how would the results of this experiment would have changed?
So if you are asking if we have chosen the conservative mode of replication, then how would it have changed, right?
Yes, sir.
So that could be a nice assignment for the students, right? You go ahead and calculate. So here it was 50% hybrid at the end of the first generation. 50% of the molecules was all the molecules was hybrid, right? This is the parental DNA, which is, say, for example, N15. So at the parental DNA, you should be getting everything as a heavy. That should be true for both of the cases. But at the end of the first generation, if it is following the semi-conservative mode, then you should be having 100% hybrid molecule. But if it is following the conservative model, then you should be having 50% light and 50% heavy and 50% light, right? At the end of the second generation, here you should be getting 50% hybrid and 50% light. But in this particular case, you should be having 75% light and 125% heavy, right? So in that way, if it would have followed the conservative mode of DNA replication, the pattern of the DNA bands in the density gradient centrifugation should have been completely different from what Michelson and Stolz have observed, right? What has been observed falls in line with the semi-conservative mode. Okay. So that's a great question. Definitely, if you want to create the pattern for the conservative mode, go ahead and draw that. You should be able to see that that should completely be different from what has been observed by Michelson and Stoll. Okay. All right.
Yes, sir. So no.
Sorry.
So no hybrid would be observed.
No hybrid would have been observed. Right. Right. Okay. Now moving on to the next topic. That is, so now we know that the DNA replication happens in a semi-conservative mode. Okay. Now, how does the DNA polymerase performs this semi-conservative mode of DNA replication? This is what we are going to talk about. Now, the DNA replication have very distinct phases. That is the initiation, priming, elongation, and then termination. But we are not going to discuss it in a conventional way. Okay. Rather, what I usually like to do is to present the mechanism of DNA replication in a little bit of different approach. So first of all, but before going into the mechanism of DNA replication, I should mention that it's Professor Arthur Kornberg who has actually elucidated or discovered the mode of DNA replication. Okay, and for that he received Nobel Prize in 1959. You can imagine that particular decade was extremely important in terms of the molecular biology research, right? 1953, when the Watson and Crick has discovered the structure of the DNA, double helix DNA, and then subsequently 1958, when Messelson and Stoll has shown that the DNA replication follows the semi-conservative mode, and then subsequently Professor Arthur Kornberg almost at the same time was working in order to understand the mechanism of DNA replication. Okay, and he has elucidated the mechanism in 1956. Okay, and subsequently he got Nobel Prize in 1959. Okay, now before getting into the mechanism of DNA replication, I would like to mention that these are the key components, okay, which are used during the DNA replication process. First of all, you need the raw material in order to synthesize a polymer. DNA is nothing but a nucleic acid, which is a polymer of nucleotides, right? We have discussed about the structure of the DNA in the previous class, where we have shown that it's nothing but so DNA is, or the nucleic acid is a polymer which is composed of monomeric units which are known as nucleotides. Individual nucleotides gets attached to each other through phosphodiester linkages in order to form these long chain of polymers. Okay. Now individual nucleotides, so hence during the DNA replication you need these individual nucleotides, DATP, DTTP, DGTP and DCTP. Okay, so these are the individual nucleotides which are needed for the DNA replication process. Then, as I have mentioned, any DNA synthesis or DNA replication cannot occur without a DNA template. So the second one is basically the DNA template. The polymer is always actually read the DNA template in order to synthesize the nascent DNA strand. So that's why the second component which is needed for the DNA replication process is the DNA template. Third one is the key enzyme, which is the DNA polymerase. Okay, why it's called DNA and polymerase? So because it synthesizes DNA, so that's why DNA, and then it basically polymerizes the individual nucleotides or the monomeric units. So it forms a polymer. So that's why polymerase. Okay, as I have mentioned in the previous class, for any enzyme, you should be able to see these last three letters are common, A's. Okay, if it is a polymer forming enzyme, so we call it a polymerase. If it is forming DNA polymer, that means the DNA polymerase. Okay, and these enzymes oftentimes needs divalent cations. In this particular case, DNA polymerase needs magnesium ion, which is a cofactor for its for the enzyme, and cofactors are extremely essential for the enzymatic activity of the enzyme. So later on in this particular course, you will see that there is a one lecture which will be dedicated for the enzymes, and there you will see the mode of action of enzymes, and the cofactors of the enzyme plays very important role in the enzymatic activity. Okay, so that's why if you remove magnesium ion from the reaction, the DNA replication, the DNA polymerase will stop performing its action, and hence that replication will not happen. Okay, so if you look into the basic mechanism of DNA replication or the chemical reaction of the DNA replication, this is how it looks like. Okay, so this is one particular nucleotide. Okay, so the deoxyribose, so this is the ribose sugar, and you have the nomenclature 1', 2', 3, 4, 5, right? and you have a 2' hydrogen at the 2' position, and instead of OH you have a hydrogen. That's why deoxyribose. So this is a deoxyribose sugar where the nitrogenous bases, the guanine base in this particular case, is attached to the 1' position. And then you have a triphosphate moiety attached to the 5' CH2OH through a phosphoester bond. Okay, so this is a triphosphate moiety, you have a sugar, and then you have a base. Okay, now say for example this is an existing DNA strand. Okay, so this is sugar, base, and phosphate. So sugar, base, and phosphate. Again, sugar, base, and phosphate, and these two moieties. So this is one nucleotide, right? So this is one unit or one nucleotide, which is attached to the second one through this phosphodiester linkage. Similarly, the second one is attached to the third one through this phosphodiester linkage. So, as I have mentioned in the previous class, for any DNA strand, any chain of DNA, you should have a free 5' phosphate. So this is the free 5' phosphate, and on the other end you should have a free 3' OH. Here the 3' OH, right? And now imagine that this nucleotide, there is an incoming nucleotide or DGTP, which is coming so that it could be incorporated in this particular chain. And in order to get incorporated, what needs to be done is basically the last 3' OH, the free 3' OH, will perform a nucleophilic attack at this particular position. So this will perform a nucleophilic attack at this position. Okay, and as a result of that, the diphosphate will be released and it will get attached through another phosphodiester bond. So this has performed a nucleophilic attack at the alpha phosphate of the incoming nucleotide. The diphosphate has been released and a new phosphate bond has been formed. And as a result of that, this nucleotide got incorporated into the existing DNA chain, regenerating another 3' OH, which is now ready to conduct the next step of the reaction, which is incorporating the next nucleotide in the DNA chain. So this is how the DNA polymerization happens. But then how the entire process of replication is happening, how this DNA polymerization process is happening by the DNA enzyme, DNA polymerase. Okay, so now,
Sir, in case of the triphosphate moiety, why is the bond between oxygen and phosphorus shown with a tilde? Like, is there any special reason?
this one?
In the case of the triphosphate moiety, yeah, that one. Why
This
is it
one,
shown
right?
with, yeah.
Yeah, this is just to show that these two moieties will be released. Okay, so once you perform a nucleophilic attack, there will be a negative bond, negative charge over here, right? And as a result of that, the entire, this particular part will be released. So this is not a part of the, this moiety will not become a part of the DNA. This will be removed. Whereas this part, up to this part, it will be incorporated. Okay? Yeah. So this is the chemical basis of the DNA polymerization process. But how does it happen during the DNA replication process? Let's look into that. So in order to perform the DNA replication process, what needs to be done is basically so instead of looking into the process by a conventional way, that is the initiation, then priming, then elongation, and then termination, these are the 4 steps: initiation, priming, elongation, and termination. These are the 4 steps. But rather than just memorizing these individual steps, I would like to present the DNA replication process in terms of the problems that nature has faced while it is designing this particular technique. Right? This is an extremely complicated technique. Mother Nature must have invested significant amount of time to decide that how the DNA replication will happen, will going to happen in the living organisms, because this is the most fundamental, one of the most fundamental event of life. If there is a problem in the DNA replication, you will have lethal problem, right? One of the major problem of the DNA replication, one of the major disease that happens during the due to the problem in the DNA replication is cancer. If the DNA replication is not happening properly, you will be incorporating mutations, and those kind of mutations can lead to uncontrolled DNA replication and hence uncontrolled cell division. That uncontrolled cell division will lead to formation of tumor or tumorous growths, finally leading to cancer. Right? So this is the most fundamental process of life. So definitely Mother Nature has invested significant period of time in order to design this process. And while designing the process, what might be the problems that she has faced and how she has overcome these problems. Okay, let's try to discuss it in this way. So first of all, as we have shown that the DNA replication follows the semi-conservative mode, right? That means so it's a DNA is a double helix, right? It's a double-stranded helical structure. Now that helical structure needs to be unwinded, right? So that each of the parental strand could be utilized as a template to synthesize the new DNA strands, right? So the first problem of the DNA replication is the initiation phase, which is how does the double-stranded DNA could be separated from each other so that they can act as a template for the synthesis of the nascent DNA strand. Now in our previous class, we have discussed that how can you separate the two DNA strands from each other. If anyone wants to recap that particular experiment, that how you can actually separate the two strands of a double-stranded DNA. Hello?
So by applying heat?
Yes, you just heat it up and it will break. The energy will be providing in the form of the heat. It will break apart the hydrogen bonds, which is responsible for the base pairing, and that will separate the two DNA strands from each other. Now, if you remember the melting curve that I have shown you in the last class, you have to heat the DNA up to 70-80 degrees in order to completely denature the DNA, or in order to completely separate the two DNA strands from each other. What does that mean? That means during the DNA replication process, you have to raise your internal temperature to 80-90 degrees centigrade. If it is it feasible? No, right? That means you have to, Mother Nature must have to have a strategy so that the DNA could be separated, the two strands of the DNA could be separated from each other. Okay, so that the DNA replication could be initiated. Okay, so there is one particular enzyme called helicase, okay, which actually can rupture the base pairs, the hydrogen bonds, which is responsible for the base pairing, so that it can separate the two DNA strands from each other at a physiological temperature. Okay, that means at a regular temperature, at a room temperature. It can separate the two DNA strands by breaking all those hydrogen bonds which are responsible for the base pairing. Okay, now while it definitely rupturing these bonds or breaking these bonds will need energy. Where does this particular enzyme gets the energy? Because it performs the entire reaction or the entire process at a room temperature.
From
So,
ATP?
yes, so it utilizes ATP and hydrolyzes it to ADP, and that energy it utilizes in order to separate the two DNA strands from each other. Okay, now why it's called helicase? If anyone wants to answer.
It
Why
destroys the helical structure of the DNA.
Excellent. So it basically destroys the helical structure of the DNA, and that's why it's known as helicase, right? See, you don't have to memorize these names. You just memorize that first step of the DNA is basically the destruction of the helical structure so that the two DNA strands could be separated from each other. That means you have to destroy the helical structure. Who is going to destroy the helical structure to open up the two DNA strands from each other? It must be an enzyme, so it should have the last three letters, that the A's, right? And it, because it's breaking the helical structure, that's why it's helicase, right? So the initiation of the DNA replication process, helicase first comes in and unwinds the two DNA strands from each other, and for this purpose it utilizes ATP, it utilizes the energy by hydrolyzing ATP to ADP so that it can break apart the base pairs or the hydrogen bonds which are responsible for the base pairing. Okay, now if you think about the DNA, it's a helical structure. Okay, you think about two particular strings which are helically coiled to each other. You fix one particular point of that particular rope at one point, and then you keep on separating the two strings from each other. What will happen? It will introduce supercoiling before, as you keep on separating the two DNA strands, two strings of the strands from each other, it will introduce more and more supercoiling in this particular region, right? Eventually what will happen is it will be, there will be so much of supercoiling, it will inhibit the unwinding of the DNA, right? So that's why while the helicase is unwinding the DNA, it is constantly introducing supercoiling in front of the replication fork. So this is the replication fork. Because of this unique structure, this is known as fork. Okay, replication fork. So while the helicase will be unwinding the two strands of the DNA, it will be introducing it will be introducing supercoiling in front of the replication fork, and eventually those supercoiling structures will be impose mechanical inhibition towards the helicase, so that the helicase will not be able to unwind the two strands from each other anymore. Okay, and eventually the DNA replication would stop. Okay, so in order to solve this particular problem, there is another enzyme which is known as topoisomerase. Okay, now what it does is basically, how can you relax supercoiling which is getting introduced in one particular loop? Is it possible that you can relax the supercoiling? So say for example, you have a rope where two strings are coiled to each other, and you started unwinding the two strings, started separating the two strings from each other, right? So that will introduce huge amount of coiling, super coiling in front of the fork, right? Now, how can you release that super coiling?
So maybe we can rotate the other end of the rope. That might relax some of the super coiling.
You can rotate, but other than rotating, say for example, imagine if you can cut one of the strings, it will immediately unwind, it will keep on unwinding until unless the supercoiling gets released, right? So that's the role that topoisomerase does. So basically topoisomerase is an enzyme which can cut one strand of the DNA. Subsequently, it can rotate that particular strand of the DNA in the opposite direction so that it can release the supercoiling. And once the supercoiling gets released, so that the helicase can again proceed, it can rejoin back that strand. So that now again the helicase is ready to unwind the strands. Okay. So this is the initiation step of the DNA replication process. There are two enzymes. First of all, there is a helicase which unwinds the DNA, and then the topoisomerase which relaxes the supercoiling. Also, for all the living organism, DNA remains as a double-stranded form. Okay. Whenever it becomes single-stranded, there is a chance that it can get degraded by cellular enzymes itself. Okay. Why? Because some of the pathogens have single-stranded DNA or can produce single-stranded DNA inside the cell. So that's why our immune system has some enzymes which can recognize these single-stranded DNA as a signature of pathogen infection. And whenever they will find these kind of single-stranded DNA, they will start chopping them off so that they can stop the infection. That's why when the DNA is getting unwinded, it will generate the single-stranded DNA, and those enzymes can also rupture the single-stranded DNA, which is a part of the cell. Okay, so in order to avoid this problem, there are proteins which is known as single-stranded DNA binding proteins, or SSBs. So while the helicase is unwinding the DNA, generating single-stranded DNAs, the single-stranded binding proteins will constantly wrapping up these single-stranded DNA so that they do not get degraded by the cellular enzymes. Okay, so three different proteins take part in the initiation phase of the DNA replication process. First one is the helicase, which unwinds the DNA. Second one is the topoisomerase, which relaxes the supercoiling. And third one is the single-stranded binding proteins, which protects the single-stranded DNAs. Any question? Okay, if not, then let's proceed to the next part, which is the priming part. Okay, we have talked about the initiation. Next is the priming. So, and there comes the problem 2. Okay, so what I have shown you is the basis, the chemical reaction which happens during the DNA replication process is there has to be existing DNA strand where you have a free 3' OH, and that 3' OH can perform a nucleophilic attack on the alpha phosphate so that it releases the diphosphate moiety and incorporate the incoming nucleotide, generating another new phosphodiester bond and a 3' OH, which can then participate in the next step of reaction, next phase of polymerization, right? But for this process, you need an existing 3' OH. But if you think about the very beginning of the DNA replication process, who will serve this free 3' OH? Because there is no DNA, right? You are just initiating the DNA replication process. So there is no DNA which is already present. So who will provide this 3' OH in order to perform the first incorporation or first DNA step of the DNA replication process? Okay. In order to solve that, nature has devised another enzyme which is called primase. Okay. Now primase is nothing but a RNA polymerase. It can synthesize, it can read the DNA template and synthesize a RNA primer. Okay, RNA, small RNA. Okay, because DNA polymerase always needs an existing primer. Okay, which will provide the free 3' OH. But the RNA polymerase can synthesize, doesn't need a primer. Okay, it can synthesize the RNA without a primer. So it can initiate the reaction de novo. Okay, so here the primase is a RNA polymerase which can read the DNA template and synthesize a small RNA. Now, whether it's a DNA or RNA, it should be able to provide the OH, right? A free 3' OH. So what happens is primer first synthesizes a small RNA primer. Okay, and that's why it's known as primase. And that 3' OH now can be utilized by the DNA polymerase in order to initiate the DNA synthesis. So one particular DNA polymerase performs the DNA synthesis. There are two different kinds of DNA polymerase that we are going to talk about. And actually the DNA polymerase 3 synthesizes the DNA. Okay, so here utilizing the 3' OH of the RNA primer, the DNA polymerase can initiate the DNA synthesis and then can extend that so that the DNA polymerization process could be initiated. Now, if you look into this particular reaction again, so this is the 5' phosphate. This is the 5' phosphate and this is the 3' OH. Right? So in which particular direction the DNA is getting synthesized?
5 to 3.
5' to 3', right? So that means, and that is true for all the DNA synthesis. The DNA polymerase should read the template in a 3' to 5' direction, and it should be synthesizing the DNA in a 5' to 3' direction. So see, in this particular case, this is the RNA primer. DNA polymerase has utilized the 3' OH and initiated the DNA synthesis. So it's reading the template in a 3' to 5' direction, and it's synthesizing the DNA from 5' to 3' direction. Okay, and as the helicase will be proceeding in this direction, the DNA polymerase can follow the helicase so that it can keep on synthesizing the DNA in the 5' to 3' orientation. Okay. Now, if you think about the other strand, let's think about the other strand. Do you envisage any problem for DNA synthesis in this particular case? What is the direction of the DNA synthesis that should be happening in this case?
It basically cannot start from the free end.
It cannot start from the free end, right? Rather, it has to say, for example, the primase has to initiate, synthesize a primer somewhere in between, in the middle, and then the DNA polymerase can initiate the DNA synthesis to synthesize the DNA in a 5' to 3' orientation. Okay. Subsequently, again it has to synthesize DNA, another RNA primer. The primase has to synthesize another primer, and then the DNA polymerase has to synthesize in the opposite orientation, right? So there will be multiple. So for this particular strand, it will be a continuous synthesis of DNA synthesis. Okay. Whereas for the opposite strand, it will be a discontinuous synthesis of DNA synthesis. Why? Because think about the case here. So for example, here you have a DNA strand. Okay. Now you have a point A, point B, point C, and so on. Okay. Now the helicase unwinds up to point A. So this is point A. This is point B. And this is point C. Now, for the leading strand, it will synthesize a primer here and it will be following the direction of the helicase. For the other strand, it will synthesize a primer here and it will move on to the opposite direction, right? Then again, in the next step, what will happen is the helicase will keep on unwinding the DNA and the leading strand will be continuously synthesizing the DNA. But in this particular case, say for example, this is A and this is B and this is C, right? So initially the primase has synthesized primer here and the DNA replication happened in this direction. But now again the primase has to synthesize another primer which again will be following in this direction. In the next step, again it will be unwinded up to the point C and again there will be a new primer synthesis which will be following in the opposite direction. So that's why there will be multiple primer in the lagging strand. There will be multiple primer formation and subsequent formation of the DNA strands. Okay, and as a result of that, there will be a discontinuous synthesis of DNA strands in the lagging strand. In the leading strand, it will be a continuous synthesis of one single DNA strand. But for the lagging strand, it will be a discontinuous synthesis of the DNA. Okay, where you should be able to find multiple RNA primers in between the DNA strands. Okay. So these fragments were first visualized using electron microscopy by a Japanese professor called Okazaki. And after his name, these discontinuous DNA fragments in the lagging strand was named as Okazaki fragments. Okay. So this is the second step, that is the primer and priming and elongation. Okay. Now coming to the last problem, that is the problem 3, which is you have introduced multiple RNA primers in the middle of the DNA. Now, as you know that RNA are less stable than the DNA, right? So that means these RNA primers needs to be removed before the DNA synthesis could be completed. Okay, so for that, there is 2 more enzymes. First of all, one enzyme which is known as RNase H. Okay, so this RNase H enzyme is so basically there is another DNA polymerase which is the DNA polymerase 1. Now DNA polymerase 1 contains 2 different enzymatic activity. First one is basically the RNase H activity. Okay, and RNase means one enzyme which can destroy the RNA. H stands for hybrid. If there is a RNA-DNA hybrid, this particular enzyme can recognize that RNA and specifically destroy that RNA. So that's why the H comes from. Okay, so this RNase enzyme can specifically destroy the RNAs which remain in hybrid with the DNA. So that's why RNase H. So first of all, the DNA polymerase comes in and utilizing its RNase H activity, it removes the RNA primer or it destroys the RNA primer. As a result of that, it introduces gaps in between the DNA fragments. Okay. Subsequently, because it's a DNA polymerase, it can synthesize the DNA. Okay. So, and now here you don't need a RNA primer because you already have the 3' OH here, right? You have a 3' OH here. You have a 3' OH here, and so on, right? So everywhere you have a 3' OH. So now it doesn't need a primer. So the DNA polymerase 1 can come in and utilizing these 3' OH, it can synthesize the DNA so that it can fill in the gaps. But when it reaches the preceding DNA fragment, it stops. As a result of that, although it can fill in the gaps, there are breaks in between the DNA fragments. Okay, so there are no gaps, but there are breaks in between. So there comes another enzyme called ligase. And ligase actually can join the two DNA fragments together. So it can utilize the 3' OH here and the 5' phosphate here, and it can join them together. Okay, so gaps or breaks can be sealed by the ligase. So first of all, the DNA polymerase comes in, it removes the RNA primers. Second, the DNA polymerase can fill in the gaps by synthesizing these DNA fragments, small DNA fragments, and then the ligase can join these DNA fragments together to make it a continuous DNA fragment, a continuous DNA strand. Okay, so this is the replication of, this is the summary of the DNA replication process, and feel free to ask any questions if you have. Okay, if not, then we are going to proceed into the next topic. Okay, where so far we have discussed about the structure of the DNA, the chemical nature of the DNA. Then we have talked about the particular mode of DNA replication process which it follows, that is the semi-conservative mode of DNA replication. Then we have discussed about the mechanism of DNA replication process. Now we are going to talk about some of the experimental approaches or some of the methods which actually has revolutionized the recombinant DNA technology, or basically the molecular biology, okay, the field of molecular biology, which are basically related to the nucleic acids or DNAs. Okay, first of all, we are going to talk about that how can you, so still now we are discussing about the DNAs, but is it possible to visualize the DNA? Is it possible to analyze the DNA? Okay, for example, in a lot of the sci-fi movies, you have seen that you take the DNA and then you perform some kind of experiments to analyze the sequence of the DNA. Okay, for example, for the crime stories, you have seen that the forensic experts collect the samples from the crime scene and then you analyze the sequence of the DNA, and then they can tell that from which particular person it has came, so that you can identify the criminal. How does they do that? Okay, so in order to understand that, we have to understand that how the DNA could be analyzed using laboratory techniques. Okay, so first of all, is it possible to visualize the DNA in the laboratory? Okay, and is it possible to separate different DNAs from each other based upon their molecular weight. We have already discussed about the density gradient centrifugation process, where you can actually separate different DNAs from each other. But that's a long-standing experiment. That's a really lengthy experiment. You have to. It takes about 4 to 5 hours to prepare the gradient, and then you have to centrifuge them for again 4-5 hours to separate different DNAs from each other. Okay, so but you can easily analyze different DNAs from each other based upon their sizes using DNA gel electrophoresis. So this is the DNA gel electrophoresis apparatus. So this is how the apparatus looks like, and you have a tray here. Okay, so this is the magnified image of this particular portion. Okay, so first of all, what you do is you have to prepare a gel, okay, which is the medium through which the DNA will migrate and subsequently get separated based upon their size. So here what we do is basically you take the tray and then you melt some agarose. Usually it remains in the solidified form, but if you heat it up, it gets melted. And then once it gets melted, you pour it in the tray so that it can take up the shape of the tray. Once you cool it down, it will get solidified, and then it will take up the shape of the tray. Okay, and while solidifying, you add some comb kind of structure so that you can form some holes in this agarose slab. Okay, so these are the individual holes. So then once you have the gel, you put it in the buffer which contains some salts. Okay, and then you apply electric field. So this is the negative electrode and this is the positive electrode. Subsequently, you load the DNA into the gel. So you add the DNA solution into these holes and apply electric field. Okay, and it should migrate from negative to positive direction. Now, if I ask that why should it migrate from negative to positive direction? If anybody wants to answer.
Because of phosphate group.
Yeah, so DNA is the backbone contains phosphate moieties, right? So that's why the DNA are negatively charged. Okay, so that's why if you apply electric field on the DNA, it should migrate from negative to positive electrode. Okay, and while migrating, because it will be facing frictional force, because it is migrating through the agarose slab, and this agarose slab have different small pores. So the DNA molecule should be migrating through those pores. Now the smaller is the DNA molecule, it should be migrating faster because it will be facing lesser frictional forces. The bigger is the DNA molecule, it will be facing higher frictional forces, right? So the smaller is the DNA, the faster it will migrate. The higher will be the molecular weight of the DNA, it will migrate slower. So you can separate different DNA molecules based upon their molecular weight. But then how can you visualize these DNAs? For example, here you have ran different DNAs of different molecular weight, and each of these bands corresponds to one particular DNA molecule. And once the gel running is done, you can put it on the top of the UV light, okay, UV lamp, and you should be able to visualize these kind of picture. But how can the DNA is fluorescing, becomes fluorescent active? DNAs are usually fluorescent inactive, so you shouldn't be able to. You're not supposed to see them under the UV light, but still they're getting seen. How can you visualize that? In order to visualize, what we do is basically you add one particular molecule, a chemical molecule which is fluorescent active. It is known as ethidium bromide. Okay, now if you look into if you just Google ethydium bromide and try to look into the chemical structure of the ethydium bromide, it's a completely planar molecule. Okay, it looks similar to the nitrogenous bases. What happens is basically, and it's a positively charged molecule. So because you have ethydium bromide molecules spread all across the agar slab, when you apply electric field, the DNA will start migrating from negative towards positive direction, and all the ethydium bromide molecule will start migrating in the opposite direction. That means from positive towards negative direction. Okay, and eventually they will collide, and whenever the ethydium bromide molecules will be colliding with the DNAs, they will be situated, they will take the space in between the base pairs. So say for example, this is a DNA molecule, and you have the base pairs like this, and base pairs represents planar structures, right? Now, because the ethydium bromide are also planar, they can take the space in between the bases like this. So throughout the length of the DNA, the ethydium bromide can be incorporated in between the bases. And this process is known as intercalation. Means the dye, which is basically the ethydium bromide, which is basically a fluorescent active dye, can be intercalated within the DNA. So now, whenever there is a DNA, there should be ethydium bromide, and once you put it on the top of a UV lamp, it will fluoresce, so that you can have a fluorescent signal specifically at the region where the DNA is, so that you can visualize the DNA. So in that way, using DNA gel electrophoresis, you can actually separate different DNA molecules from each other based upon their size, based upon their molecular weight, and at the same time, by staining them with ethydium bromide, you should be able to visualize them under the UV light. Okay, so everything is written over here. Okay, now we are going to discuss a very, very important topic, which is basically the polymerase chain reaction. Now, polymerase chain reaction actually revolutionized the field of molecular biology, because with the help of the polymerase chain reaction, you can synthesize DNA in the tubes, okay, in a laboratory setting. So we have discussed about the DNA replication process, which occurs inside a living organism. Okay, but using the polymerase chain reaction, you can synthesize the DNA, the same DNA, in reaction tubes, or you can say in vitro. That's why nowadays it's possible to prepare 1,000 replicates. So say for example, when we are talking about the criminal stories and the forensic investigations, so say for example, you get maybe a hair, just a tiny hair or a piece of skin from one particular spot, crime scene. Then you isolate the DNA from there, but you will receive very tiny amount of DNA from those samples. So it's not possible to analyze the sequence of the DNA using that very little amount of the sample. So you have to amplify the DNA. How you can amplify the DNA? You can amplify the DNA using polymerase chain reaction. Or for example, nowadays you hear a lot about the RT-PCR test for virus detection, right? I think all of you have heard about by this time about the RT-PCR test. So where you basically go to the pathology lab, and they collect a little bit of your nasal or oral swab. Okay, and from there you can collect maybe 10 virus particles. Okay, so from 10 virus particles you will get very little amount of genetic material. Now it's not possible to detect this very minute amount of the genetic material, whether it's coming from coronavirus, whether it's coming from dengue virus, or whether it's coming from influenza virus. It's not possible. In order to detect, you have to amplify that particular piece of genetic material, whether it's RNA, whether it's a DNA, you have to amplify. How you are going to amplify that? You have to use the polymerase chain reaction in order to amplify that. Okay. For example, nowadays you get a lot of enzymes. So if you are having stomach upset, you go to a doctor. They give you certain enzymes which will help you for the digestion process. Okay. There are a lot of enzymes like that. Okay. So how do you get those enzymes? Do you isolate it from human's body? No. So basically what we have done, we have prepared the DNA corresponding to those enzymes and artificially using polymerase chain reaction, and then using those DNAs you can synthesize those proteins using the recombinant DNA technology, and then you can use those recombinant proteins to treat patients. Okay, so that's why the polymerase chain reaction is a method which is extremely important in terms of the practical use, because using this particular reaction you can actually prepare DNA in a reaction tubes in a very easy manner within a very short period of time. So why polymerase chain reaction? What is polymerase chain reaction? So the PCR is an exponentially progressing synthesis of the defined target DNA sequence in vitro condition. That means within reaction tubes. It has been invented by Professor Carey Mullis in 1983, for which he got Nobel Prize in 1993. It was this discovery because of its huge impact of this particular discovery. Okay, so why polymerase chain reaction? First of all, why polymerase? Because as you have seen, in case of the DNA replication process, you need different enzymes. You need helicase, you need topoisomerase, primase, DNA polymerase 3, DNA polymerase 1, then you need DNA ligase, everything. A lot of different enzymes, right? But for this particular in vitro synthesis, artificial synthesis of the DNA, you need one single enzyme, and that is the DNA polymerase. You don't need anything else. Okay, so that's why it's called polymerase chain reaction, because polymerase is the single enzyme which is used this particular in this reaction. And why chain reaction? Because here product from one step of the reaction is used as a substrate for the next step of the reaction. Okay, and because it happens in a chain reaction fashion, that's why it can amplify the DNA in an exponential fashion. Okay, let's see how it works. Again, what you need to do in order to perform, what are the things that you need in order to perform the polymerase chain reaction? First of all, as I have mentioned, that DNA replication should always happen in a template dependent fashion. So be it the natural DNA replication process inside the cell or the polymerase chain reaction which is happening in vitro in the reaction tubes. But you need the target DNA or the template DNA. Okay, so you need to have a template DNA or the target DNA which needs to be amplified. Okay. Second, you need DNTPs. Let me come to the primer a little bit later, but you need DNTPs, which are the raw materials. Okay, definitely you need DNTPs. Without the DNTPs, you will not be able to synthesize the DNA. Then you need magnesium ions, which act as a cofactor of the DNA polymerase. And then definitely for optimum activity of the enzyme, you need to maintain the pH of the solution, and that's why you need a buffer solution. I have intentionally skipped two particular components, which is this one and this one. Okay, let me discuss about that. So when we have talked about the DNA replication process. What was the first step of DNA replication? What was the first step of the initiation of the DNA replication?
Unwinding of the DNA strands by helicase.
Yes. So unwinding of the DNA strands by the helicase, right? But here what I have mentioned is the single polymerase that you'll be using is basically DNA polymerase. You are not going to use any helicase. Then how can you initiate the DNA replication process?
Heating to separate the DNA strands.
Yes. So you can just heat the template, the target DNA, which is the double-stranded DNA. You just heat it up to separate the two DNA strands from each other. Okay. So that there will be no need of having the helicase. Also, because of the mode of action of the helicase, that is, it unwinds the DNA strands from one particular direction. That's why you introduce the supercoiling in front of the replication fork, right? But if you are utilizing heat, you are separating the strands from each other completely. Okay, it's not that you are separating it in a directional fashion. You are applying heat and you are randomly rupturing the strands, the base pairs all across the DNA strands, and as a result of that, they will get separated. So that's why you don't need helicase, you don't need topoisomerase, right? But in that case, you have to heat the sample at a 90, more than 90 degrees centigrade, sometimes 95, sometimes 98 degrees centigrade. Now, if you use a regular DNA polymerase, so for example, a human DNA polymerase, or for example, a E. coli DNA polymerase, regular polymerase isolated from regular bacteria, and you heat it up at a really high temperature, 98 degrees centigrade, what will happen?
The enzyme will get destroyed.
The enzyme will get destroyed, or you can say the enzyme will get denatured. Just like you heat the boil white, the egg white, and it gets denatured. Similarly, you heat your DNA polymerase at a really high temperature, it will be destroyed. It will be denatured. It will lose its activity, right? That's why you need a enzyme which should be stable at a really high temperature, a DNA polymerase which will be stable at a really high temperature. Okay, for that scientists have discovered a particular bacteria from the hot geyser basins of Yellowstone National Park. Okay, so Yellowstone National Park is a park in the United States, and there you will find hundreds of these kind of hot geyser basins. So you see, the water inside these basins are always boiling, and you see this nice yellow to orange color which is surrounding these basins. So these are due to different kinds of bacteria which resides within these basins. And these bacteria are basically thermophilic bacteria or heat loving bacteria. They can only reside at a really high temperature where the water is always boiling. Okay. And that's why they have, so scientists have discovered, so one of the colleague of Professor Carey Mullis, he has actually utilized this particular natural phenomena that there are certain bacteria which loves to divide, live and divide in these really high temperature. That means for their DNA replication, they must be having a DNA polymerase which can retain really high heats and should be functional at a high temperature. So they have isolated a particular bacteria called Thermus aquaticus. Okay. And from there, they have isolated the DNA polymerase and studied its activity. What they saw, as per their expectations, what they saw is basically they have a polymerase which named after the Thermus aquaticus as a Taq DNA polymerase, which can retain really high temperature, which remains stable at a 95 to 100 degrees centigrade. Okay, not only that, their optimum activity is they show optimum activity of DNA polymerization at a really high temperature at 72 degrees centigrade, 68 to 70 degrees centigrade. Okay, so what they did is they have used this particular enzyme to perform the PCR reaction. Okay, not only that, so after the initiation process, what was the next step of the DNA polymerase, DNA replication event? After the initiation?
Attachment of RNA primer.
Yes, synthesis of RNA primer by by the primase, right? But here what I have mentioned, you can only use one single polymerase. You cannot use RNA primer, because if you are using primase, that means it will be synthesizing RNA primer. In that case, again, you have to remove those RNA primers. In that case, you will need DNA polymerase 1, which will be removing those RNA primers, right? Again, that will be synthesizing it needs to synthesize the DNA. Then those DNAs needs to be joined, so that you need ligase, right? So if you can avoid the RNA primers, you should be able to avoid the necessity of primase, DNA polymerase 1 as well as ligase, right? And how you can avoid? You can just add primers exogenously, DNA primers. Okay, so in the reaction, you add target DNA, you add DNTPs, you add thermostable DNA polymerase. Along with that, you also add primers, which will which will base pair with the target DNA, and they will serve as a source of the 3' OH, which is essential to initiate the replication process. Okay, so let's see how does the polymerase chain reaction happens. So say for example, this is your target DNA, and this is the region of the double-stranded DNA you want to amplify. So you want to make millions of copies of this particular region of the DNA. So the first step would be to heat the double-stranded DNA at a 98 degree centigrade, okay, or 95 degrees centigrade, so that you can separate the two DNA strands from each other. Okay. Subsequently, what would happen is, if you already have added pairs of primers which can anneal here and here, but they will not be able to anneal at such a high temperature, right? So you bring it down to a regular temperature, okay, around like 50 degrees, so that these primers can now anneal to their complementary region in the target DNA. So now the primer has annealed. So this initial stage is known as denaturation or heat denaturation. Second step is basically annealing. Why? Because at this step, the primers is getting annealed to the target DNA template. And subsequently, then you raise the temperature to 70 to 72 degrees centigrade, where the DNA polymerase will initiate the synthesis utilizing the 3' OH provided by the primers. Okay, so here you see the DNA polymerase has synthesized the complementary DNA strand, so that by the end of the first cycle, you will be having two daughter strands, okay, again synthesized in a semi-conservative mode. Okay, so at the end of the first cycle, you are getting two daughter strands. Let's see. Now you have, let's think about the second cycle. So you have this product achieved after the end of the first cycle. They should be acting as a substrate for the second cycle. So during the second cycle, again, you will heat them up. So you perform the denaturation process. They will get separated from each other. Then you perform the annealing process. The primers will anneal, and then you increase the temperature to 72 degree so that the Taq polymerase can synthesize the complementary strands, right? So by the end of the second cycle, how many strands, how many DNA templates you are getting, DNA products you are getting? 4, right? That means 2 to the power 2. Similarly, at the end of the third cycle, you will be getting 2 to the power 3. That means 8, right? And if you keep on performing this event, so this is different temperatures and the time period for different steps. So for example, the heat denaturation, you perform the denaturation for 98 degrees centigrade for 45 seconds. Then you reduce the temperature to 62 degrees where the primers will anneal to the target DNA, and then you raise the temperature to 72 degree where it can perform the Taq DNA polymerase can perform the synthesis, and you repeat the same steps for 20 to 35 cycles. So if you are performing 30 cycles of this particular step from a single piece of double-stranded DNA, you should be able to synthesize 2 to the power 30 copies of the product. That means that single double-stranded DNA which you may have isolated from a living organism, you can amplify that to this many numbers, 2 to the power 30 numbers within very small period of time. So you see 40 plus 30 plus 1.18, and then you multiply it with 30. It will be around like 1.5 hours. But within that small period of time, you should be able to prepare this many copies of the corresponding DNA. Okay. And this is the tiny reaction tubes where you can perform these reactions. Okay. And this is a tabletop instrument called thermal cycler. Why thermal cycler? Because it can perform different thermal steps in a cyclic fashion. So that's why thermal cycler. It's not bigger than 1 feet by 1 feet. Okay. So in such a small instrument within this such a small reaction tubes, you can synthesize huge number of copies of the DNA within 1 hour time period. Okay. So this is the PCR reaction. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so no questions so far. So then we'll move on to the next and the last topic of this particular lecture, which is the DNA sequencing process. Okay. Now, DNA sequencing has been discovered by Frederick Sanger. Okay. And DNA sequencing is basically a process by which you can determine the exact order of the nucleotide in a given region of the DNA. So why it's important to know the sequence of the DNA? Because by understanding the sequence of the DNA, so when in the last class we have talked about that the DNA is the media where all the genetic information remains embedded. You store all the genetic information, or you can say the nature has written its script of the genetic information in the language of the DNA. And how many letters are there? There are only 4 letters, ATGC. So utilizing these 4 letters, it has incorporated huge amount of information within the DNA. Now, if you can read the sequence, if you can determine the sequence of the DNA, you should be able to understand the information which resides within the DNA. Okay. So that's why it is extremely important in order to analyze the sequence of the DNA. Now, Frederick Sanger in 1980 has discovered a technique for sequencing the DNA, or to know the sequence of the bases or within a particular piece of the DNA. What is the principle of this particular technique? The principle is very similar to the DNA replication process. Okay, so here what we do is basically, this is the DNTP, right? So here you have the 2' H and 3' OH, and this is a analog of DNTP, which is DDNTP, or this is 2' deoxyribose, and this is 2' 3' deoxyribose. So in the case of the DDNTP, it has hydrogen at both 3', 2' and 3' position. Now, if you use a DDNTP in the DNA replication process, what will happen? Anybody wants to answer? So say for example, let's see. Anybody wants to answer?
End of the chain.
So there won't be any phosphodiester bond.
Yeah, so end of the chain reaction, right? So this is the regular DNA polymerization process, right? You have a free 3' OH which performs the nucleophilic attack at the alpha phosphate to incorporate that particular nucleotide, which then generates another OH. But then in this particular case, if you use a DDNTP analog which is lacking this particular 3' OH, what would happen? As you can see, if this particular DDNTP is lacking the 3' OH, it will get incorporated, but then there will be no 3' OH. So the chain will be terminating. So whatever chain reaction which is going on during the DNA synthesis process, that will get terminated, right? So utilizing this particular principle, you can actually sequence the DNA. How you are going to do that? Okay, let's see. So suppose we need to sequence this particular DNA template. Okay, and this is the sequence of the DNA. So we want to know the sequence of this particular template DNA. First of all, the basic principle is similar to the PCR that we have discussed. Okay, so here you use a primer first. So we are provided with a primer which can anneal to the 3' end of the sequence. So this is the template and you have a primer. So you use the primer, and subsequently then now what will happen if we add a mixture of DNTPs plus very trace amount of DDATP? What the phenomena you'll be seeing? So say for example, this is your template and this is your primer, and subsequently you want to initiate a polymerase chain reaction, okay, or a DNA replication process. Okay, how can you do that? So for that you have added a DNTP mixture where you have added DATP, DGTP, DCTP and DTTP. But along with that you have added very trace amount of DDATP. What will happen? There will always be a chance that whenever the polymerase will find a T, it will try to incorporate this DDATP. And if by mistake it will incorporate the DDATP, the chain will be terminated there, right? So say for example, if there is a incorporation of DDATP at this position corresponding to this T, the chain will be terminated and you will be getting a DNA fragment of length 8 nucleotide. Okay. Subsequently, if there is an incorporation of DDATP at this particular fragment, at this particular T, you will be getting a fragment of length 12. Next, length 15, 16. Next, length 20, 24. That means if you add DDATP in a very trace amount in a DNA replication process, you should be able to find 8, 12, 16, 20, 24 length of long DNA fragments. Okay, and from there you should be able to say that there are 8, 12, 16, 20 and 24 position there are T's. Why? Because it got terminated with DDATPs, right? So you take all these fragments and then you run them on a gel. Okay, so if you perform a gel electrophoresis, you should be able to get different fragments. Smaller fragments will be running faster, bigger fragments will be running slower. So what you can infer from that particular gel, that there are thymine at 8, 12, 16, 20, 24 positions of the template. Okay. Similarly, if you perform another reaction with DDGTP, you should be able to say that at these positions, there should be a cytosine in the template DNA. Okay. So in this way, so this is a small DNA fragment where different reactions has been performed. So DDATP, DDCTP, DDGTP and DDTTP. Okay, so four different reactions has been performed with 4 different dideoxy analogs. Subsequently, they have run gel for 4 of these reactions. Okay, so and subsequently, so say for example, this is the smallest possible fragment which corresponds to DDGTP. So you have a G. Next you have next fragment at the A. So you have a A, T, C. So this is the sequence of the complementary strand which got synthesized, right? And because it got synthesized from 3' to 5' direction, so it got synthesized from 5' to 3' direction. So that's why this is the 5' direction, this is the 3' direction, right? So the first nucleotide which got incorporated is G. And the last nucleotide which got incorporated is the A. So that's why this is 5, this is 3. And this is the sequence of the complementary DNA strand which got synthesized, right? So if you take the reverse complement, that means you have the C, T, A, G, C, T, C, G, A, C, T. And that is the sequence of the template. So see C, T, C, T, A, then G, C, then G, C. So see, by reading this particular sequence, you should be able to tell that the reverse complement should be the sequence of the template. And how you got this particular sequence? You got the sequence from the pattern of the bands, from which has been obtained from 4 different reactions using 4 different dideoxy nucleotides. Okay. Any questions, confusions? No questions so far? Okay, then we'll stop here. We have 2 more slides left for the sequencing, because this kind of approach we used to use in earlier days. Nowadays, the sequencing reaction got even more simpler, so and automated. So we are going to talk about that particular approach in the next class, and then we'll be subsequently moving into the transcription process. Okay. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.